Well, I'm very encouraged by this group of people who've shown a strong interest, I think, in changing the world and improving the world. The world is a bad place. There's too much hunger. There's too much poverty. There's too much injustice. And I think you have expressed an interest in doing something about it. And I want you to go away with the belief that you can do something about it. Now, this project is called the Manzanar Project because my origins were the Manzanar concentration camp. And all people of Japanese ancestry, when Pearl Harbor occurred, they were put into concentration camps. And I would like to think that something good can come of a concentration camp. The first slide is about the concentration camps. And the thing is, I got interested in growing food in the desert because of this camp. In the beginning, we were served canned spinach and canned Spam 3 times a day, every day. And so I began having a garden and grew vegetables. Now the thing is, the origins of this project comes from my early encounters with hardship. And I want to say that something good can come of a concentration camp. May I have the next slide, please? All right. This is the area where this work was carried out. It's the country of Eritrea, which is across the Red Sea from Saudi Arabia and is next to Ethiopia and next to the Sudan. And I read in the newspapers somewhat 20 years ago that Ethiopia was suffering famine. So I looked into the matter and found out it was Eritrea that was suffering famine because they were being starved out by the Ethiopians. And so I contacted the Eritreans, and for a long time, they didn't know whether they could trust me or not. But they finally allowed me into Eritrea, and I went into Eritrea through the Sudan. And at that time, the Sudan was a center of terrorism. Osama bin Laden was there. Carlos Jackal was there. Nobody told what they were doing. They're all very secret, except I told everybody what I was doing. I was going to Eritrea to make food. I think people didn't believe me. And I would say that the day after I left my hotel, the hotel was blown up. So Ethiopia, or the Sudan at that time, was a dangerous place to be. But I met the Eritreans, and I found they were totally admirable people. They were working to get their country free from Ethiopia. And they were very highly principled people. So immediately, I liked the Eritreans, and I wanted to help them. And so what we did was we set up fish farming in the deserts of Eritrea. And this is the first time that fish farming was done with ponds of seawater, because fish farming is usually done with fresh water, but we were doing it with seawater, and we were throwing fertilizer in the water and growing algae, and the algae would grow fish, and the fish would provide food for the wounded, and we had lots of wounded. So we took care of the wounded. But then Eritrea, within a few years, won their independence. And then I was faced with, what can I do to help these people provide food for themselves? And I walked along the shore and saw mangrove trees. And I don't know, who among you is familiar with mangrove trees? But mangrove trees grow in seawater, and they grow in tropical countries. And I saw the mangrove trees, and also saw camels eating mangrove trees. So I thought, well, I'll grow mangrove trees. Oh, wait a minute.
You can go one back.
Yeah. And I saw an area that had intertidal waters that went in and out. So I thought, this looks like where mangroves usually grow, and I will try to grow mangrove trees in this area. So I planted about 5 transplants, little plants, little trees, and they quickly died. So that was strange. So I thought about this. Why do these trees die? And I noticed that the trees only grew in places where fresh water flows into the sea periodically after a rainstorm. So, trees need fresh water. But why do they need fresh water? Well, they need fresh water because what I did was I compared the composition of seawater with the composition of algae medium. And think about algae medium. Algae medium, every item in algae medium is required by all plants. In fact, every element in algae medium is required by trees, large sequoia trees, seaweed, eelgrass, all crops. It turns out that everything requires everything in algae medium, and nothing that's not in algae medium is required by any plant. That's how evolution has occurred. So then I compared the composition of seawater with algae medium and found there's only 3 things missing from seawater. There are nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. And if we furnish these things, we can grow anything in seawater that can grow in seawater. And so I took this area that in front of in the harbor of Massawa and planted several thousand mangrove trees and furnished them with nitrogen and phosphorus, which I put into a plastic bag with a hole in it, and this fertilizer leaked out in about 4 years. And then I put pieces of iron. And then it turns out that you can grow mangrove trees anywhere where there's seawater. If you provide them with these 3 elements. So, in Eritrea, we've grown over 1 million trees in areas where trees never grew before by providing nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. And the next slide shows these trees. They're so big now they obscure the buildings behind them. And in this area, a lot of fish are there. In fact, let's see, the next slide. Oh, wait a minute. The way we planted these trees was we'd put a tin can where the seed would be implanted. It covered it with screen, have rods that would protect the trees from being washed away by kelp, being encircled by kelp and washed away. And this way we can grow millions of trees. Next slide. Now, about 5 miles from this port is the town of Hargigo, where the people are very poor and very hungry because there's no food. And this is typical housing in Eritrea, in Hargigo. Okay. Have the next slide, please. And for our trees, we have to protect them from camels, because camels can go into the muddy water. They have big feet, and they can eat the trees down to ground zero. So we have to surround our trees with barbed wire. May I have the next slide, please? And this is a forest that we planted there. As I said, we've grown about over a million trees in this way. And the thing is, this forest can be used to feed goats and sheep, as well as camels. May I have the next slide, please? This picture shows how camels can destroy our trees. May I have the next slide? Well, we keep a herd of goats and sheep, and we feed them with mangrove leaves. And the goats and sheep like mangrove leaves. And the next slide, please. Yeah. We have several hundred goats and sheep in our herd. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. Oh, and next slide. Okay. Now, the mangrove leaves are not sufficient food for goats and sheep. What we discovered early on is that if you fed goats and sheep only mangrove leaves, they would produce babies, but they wouldn't produce milk to feed the babies. But if we supplemented their food with dried fish wastes, guts and heads and bones, they can produce babies and milk. Another addition to the food is the dried mangrove seeds. And we can improve these by germinating them. Next slide. Yeah. Well, here the animals have been fed the fish meal and the seeds, and they eat everything. They leave nothing behind. Next slide. And these goats and sheep have babies twice a year. And they usually have one, but they can have as many as two. We have the next slide. These are the babies. Next slide. Next slide. Now, what we did was we gave families in the village 4 animals each. And in 4 years, they had about 30. And to have 30 animals means they're rich. They have food. The next slide. And here this family collects mangrove leaves and they feed their animals. Next slide. And the animals provide milk and meat for the family, but for the children, they're mostly pets. Next slide. And these are the homes in Hargigo. They're of old tin and scraps of wood. But they're comfortable, I think. No. Next slide. And the families all live in houses like this. And the next slide, please. And here the workers are, the way we give fertilizers, we put nitrogen and phosphorus in a plastic bag with a small hole in it, and this fertilizer leaks out in about 4 years. We calculate what rate is needed, and we put a piece of iron nearby. Next slide. And here's our workers. And the thing is, what I found is that I ran into cultural problems. Most of our workers were women, but women would not use shovels. Shovels was something only used by men. And so what I had to do was, I forced them. If you don't use a shovel, you don't get paid. And so I really changed the culture of the country. Women work with shovels. Next slide. And these are two of our workers. Mohammed. Next slide. And you see we grow 1 million trees. Next slide. And this is a young forest at 1 year. Next slide. Next slide. Now, the thing I want to do is, you know that the polar ice is melting. Right now, the sea level has risen about 1 foot. But what's going to happen? And I think by the time we realize that the rising of the sea is a danger, it'll be too late to do anything about it. So I want us to do it now. And the thing is, people don't like to fertilize the ocean because fertilizing the ocean results in part with toxic algae, namely red tide. But toxic algae and useful plants all require the same thing. They require the elements of algae medium. So it's not a useful approach to withhold fertilizer from red tide because you withhold fertilizer from kelp and eelgrass and plants that can be useful. So really the approach is we must add fertilizer in such a way that it encourages the growth of plants that are useful and doesn't encourage the growth of plants that are toxic, like red tide. And we've already done some work like this, and we find that if you take nitrogen and phosphorus and incorporate it in rocks of gypsum with a little mixed with a little cement, that you will have fertilizer that sits on the bottom of the ocean and doesn't encourage algae and toxic algae. But in order to get this accepted, we have to overcome prejudice. We have to overcome the belief that putting fertilizer in oceans is very bad. It's not very bad if it's done right. And if it's done right, all the seas can be a rich source of wealth for people. For instance, Baja California. We could fill the shores with mangrove trees and the ocean with seagrass, and you're all familiar with the grass that grows in Gloucester. That's grass that grows in seawater. So we could grow that grass in the desert and produce wealth, incredible amount of wealth, in countries where there is no wealth. And if we fertilize and grow plants in the continental shelf, we can remove all the CO2 which is thought to be causing global warming. We've now put in about 30 billion tons of CO2 into the air every year. And I think this will destroy all the major cities of the world by flooding if we don't do something about it. And we better do something about it before we know it's dangerous. And the beauty of it is we can create wealth at the same time in countries that are very poor. And if you look at the world, the estimate now is that there will be 10 billion human beings by the end of the century. And that will probably mean starvation and poverty for much of the world. But the way to control population, the most humane way and the most effective way of controlling population is to make people rich. So there's countries like Japan, Italy, where the population is shrinking because they're rich. And I think this is what we must do. And the next slide. Here in the village of Hargigo, turns out this is one of the richest fishing areas, and people take taxi cabs to drive to Argigo to catch fish. And this man can catch about 10 kilograms of fish in a few hours of work. And that's enough to feed his family. There's enough fish left over he can sell. Next slide. And this, we can cure hunger and global warming at the same time. Next slide. Oh, these are the villagers. And the next slide. Now, the reason I put this slide up is because I was a student at the California Institute of Technology, which is now rated as the #1 university in the world. In the laboratory I was in, there were 5 people that won the Nobel Prize. There was Max Delbruck, who was considered the smartest man in biology. There was Dick Feynman, who was considered the smartest man in the world. He won the Nobel Prize for quantum mechanics. There was Renato Dumbaco, who won the Nobel Prize for animal virology. There was Jim Watson, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA. And there was well, another Nobel Prize winner, I can't remember them all. But the reason I mention these people is because they were brilliant people. They were so brilliant that, I was sort of an unintelligent person by comparison. But what I want to show, or what I want to demonstrate, is that it doesn't require brilliance to make this world better. It just requires common sense and persistence. And I want all of you to believe that. And I want your children to believe it. Because I think we have to make this a better world. We live on a fragile planet, and we can destroy it. And so I want all of you to have this thought in mind forever. Yeah, thank you.